This confirmed video story, based on real life, tells of a past life experience where individuals that were married in a previous lifetime reunite in this current life. Please note that the real names of the individuals have been changed so that privacy is preserved. Remember to subscribe and share with us your past life experience. Roy and his son were rowing their boat across the Baker Lake in the northern states of Washington. Roy had recently joined one of the new Christian sects where he was baptized again. While out on the lake, the feeling suddenly overwhelmed him that the lake, the mountains, and in fact, the entire landscape was familiar to him. He knew that he had seen all this before, but not on a map or in a film. Suddenly, he saw himself alone in a canoe paddling across this lake. He had a different body and looked completely different, and was wearing the clothes of a trapper. This was a typical déjà vu experience he was having. He was so completely convinced of the reality of this experience that he had to admit to these being memories of a past life. This presented him with a huge conflict, whether to believe in reincarnation as a fact or believe that the devil had just played a trick on him. According to the beliefs of his sect, there are of course no past lives. Instead, there is the devil who tempts us in devious ways in order to distract us from our beliefs, in order to take us into his domain, which is hell itself. He continued to have flashbacks of a former life in which he was a trapper. Taking on board the beliefs of his religious sect, which to him was the only basis for happiness, he ardently prayed to God, asking him to free him of those distracting images of a previous life. One day when he was praying, he heard what he thought to be God's voice. It told him that he would soon be meeting his wife from that life, whom he had loved very much. This devil left him no peace. He secretly acquired books on reincarnation and finally plucked up courage to go and see a regression therapist to find out whether he really did live that life as a trapper in the northwestern states of America. In this regression, he discovered the following that surfaced from his subconscious. He was born just before the French Revolution and was called Jacques. His parents had fled to Canada with him. When he grew up, he became a trapper who made a living from selling furs. His hunting grounds were the hills and woods in southwest Canada and the northwestern states. After successfully saving the chief of a tribe from an invading enemy, he gained the friendship of the chief. This chief then offered him his stepdaughter in marriage and told him that she was the daughter of a white man. This man had been an alcoholic and had abandoned his daughter, leaving her behind with the chief. The daughter was very frightened of her father because he had frequently mistreated her. The chief suspected that her father would soon return to fetch his daughter, Isabel, so he asked Jacques to take her into the forest with him. This he did in order to protect her from her father. They set up camp by Lake Baker for the first few months. He fell in love with this girl and swore that he would never leave her. Later, they moved to the coast at Puget Fjords, where they built themselves a log cabin. They were very happy, apart from losing their son when she had a miscarriage. Sadly, a bear killed Jacques before he was 30 years old. During regression, he was shown that Isabel had died shortly after him, having lost the will to live and being extremely lonely. Roy was now convinced of the truth regarding reincarnation, for what he had seen in spontaneous flashbacks completely coincided with what he experienced during hypnosis. Even so, this was not the end of the story. Meanwhile, he had divorced his first wife, and even though he was now convinced of reincarnation, he still remained part of his sect. In his church, he noticed a young woman and could not take his eyes off her. He immediately felt drawn to her, but his shyness would not allow him to speak to her. They continued to meet at church until one day they spoke to each other and discovered that they both loved playing bridge. From then on, they met more often in a bridge school. After such an evening, when they were sitting in the car, Roy confided his secret to Susie. He told her that in a past life, he had been a trapper in the northeastern part of the States, which is now the United States, and that he had lived there with a young woman in a log cabin. Here, Susie interrupted him, saying that she knew that house. She then described the house in detail. Roy could not believe his ears. To his even greater amazement, she added, "We had a stillbirth. It was a boy." Then Roy looked deep into her eyes. He was now convinced that he was really looking at the reincarnation of Isabel. What was it the voice of God had said to him? Had he not spoken about introducing him to a woman whose name used to be Isabel? When he asked her how she knew that she had been that woman, she told him that 2 years ago she had found out about this past life during a meditation and had written everything down. Then they hugged each other and cried tears of joy. She promised to show him her notes at their next meeting. When Roy finally read Susie's notes, he discovered that during her meditation, a man named Jacques had come to her and had put his arms around her. He told her that they had both lived on the Puget Fjords at the end of the 18th century. He had been a French trapper from Canada, and that he would soon come to her because they belonged together. He said that first he had a few things to deal with. He told her he had been born in France and that his parents had immigrated to Canada. Jacques also described the log cabin in which they had lived and the surrounding area. He also told her about the stillbirth of their son. Susie had mentioned about this experience she had during meditation to a few close friends, who suggested that it might have something to do with the imminent meeting of her soulmate. After a year had passed, she had put the notes away and no longer gave them any thought. 2 weeks later, she decided to drive 150 kilometers to Lake Baker, where Roy had had his first déjà vu experience. When they got there, Roy decided to walk in the woods to check the traps. Susie agreed and stayed near the lake where she wanted to meditate. As soon as Roy was out of sight, Susie began to panic, which was most unusual for her. She felt like screaming so that he would come back to her as quickly as possible. When Roy returned from the woods, she told him about her fear that something might happen to him. Roy had since learned some regression techniques and suggested allowing him to lead her into regression that evening. Susie then saw herself in a life as the daughter of a couple living in the eastern part of the United States. Her name was Isabel. Her mother died when she was very young. Her father turned to alcohol and often beat her or abused her sexually. When she was 9 years old, they had moved to the most western tip of this continent. There they had traveled on foot through the forest with a group of other men. It was here that her father had met the chief. She did not know whether this chief had bought her or had stolen her from her father. The chief treated her like a daughter. When she was about 12 years old, rumors spread about her father returning to fetch her. This is why the chief had asked his white friend Jacques to take her into the forest until the danger was over. Jacques and Isabel had lived together by the lake. Her father had never found her. Sometime later, they had moved to Puget Fjords and lived there until a bear killed Jack. After that, she had been too afraid to leave the cabin and had starved to death. In this way, they both saw their past lives from various angles. To her, it was clear that all this was true about having lived in the woods. It was not long before they were a couple, as written in many fairy tale books, and they lived happily ever after. The truth is often more real than anything our imagination can come up with. Many people have had the strangest outer and inner experiences, but are too afraid to tell anyone about them out of fear of not being understood or seen as insane. Maybe these people are not insane at all. Maybe we are just short-sighted or ignorant. There are so many things we do not understand, but given time, our understanding will grow. If not in this lifetime, then definitely in our future lives. 50 or even 20 years ago, the belief in reincarnation or re-embodiment was limited to very few people in the West. Now, this belief is spreading like wildfire, for the proven facts acquired through regression into past lives are overwhelming evidence.